Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, March 19th, 2019. And today we're going to be looking at an Emerson polling poll for the 2020 presidential election race, specifically for the Democratic primary for now, and then we'll move into the general election. But this is for the state of Wisconsin. This is not a national poll. This is a Democratic primary poll from the state of Wisconsin, and also a general election poll of Donald Trump versus various Democrats, and with two of those questions including Howard Schultz as an independent candidate. Now, I do think that this poll is pretty interesting. We have some, in terms of Donald Trump, approval ratings, and we have handling of issues ratings, things like abortion, things like healthcare that are pretty vital to all voters across the country, but we're only seeing a specific swing state, and I think that this state is very important. Wisconsin was a state that Donald Trump carried back in 2016 by 22,000 votes. It was not the state he carried by the least amount, but it was still less than 1%. He both carried Michigan and Pennsylvania by less than 1% as well. And Wisconsin has been showing some tendencies to draw away from the president. As of right now, his approval rating is underwater at an overall net negative 18, and that's from the recent Morning Consult poll. And we're not going to talk too much about that. This is all about what Emerson says for the 2020 Democratic primary and general election. Now, right on your screen, we see one of the more important data charts. This is probably going to be very crucial for right now. Obviously, the general election is farther away than the primaries, but the primary season is getting pretty far into it. Every single person on this list, except for, I believe actually, except for Joe Biden, has announced that they are running for president. Now, one thing that really strikes out to me, Bernie Sanders holds on to his lead from 2016. He's at 39% of the vote. Joe Biden is at 24%. This is the first poll I've seen where Bernie Sanders is absolutely destroying Joe Biden, and I think that's pretty interesting. Yes, there are times where Bernie Sanders does get +2 over Joe Biden or +4 in New Hampshire, but it's never been to a point where it's +15. This is a double-digit lead, and it is pretty interesting. Joe Biden being in this race, 39% of the vote goes to Bernie Sanders. Now, one thing to point out, actually, if Joe Biden was not running, right here, if we scroll down here, I believe it's right here. If Joe Biden decides against running, the vote would split between Bernie Sanders at 23%, Beto O'Rourke at 20%, Kamala Harris at 16%, now Warren at 14%. So that means that this vote would break off into these other candidates. Now, that's pretty interesting. That could possibly turn the race into, a two-person race between Bernie Sanders and Beto O'Rourke, three-person race between Harris, O'Rourke, and Sanders, or a four-person race between Warren, Harris, O'Rourke, and Sanders. But obviously, Joe Biden is probably going to run, and a lot of you are saying he's probably not going to run. I don't see it that way. I really think that Joe Biden is actually going to run. I mean, he's already dropped way too many hints for him just to back out. And this time seems like it actually is his time, because I will be covering a different poll in another video that shows Joe Biden in an even better position to enter the race now than before. But Bernie Sanders being at 39% of the vote, that's really good news for the progressive vote. Now, here's what's interesting. They do have more data from the state of Wisconsin pertaining to the Democratic primaries. And we're going to go ahead and click on preview here so you can see it. Actually, it's better if you just see it right here. But the question was, what direction should the Democratic Party move in? Actually, before I get to this one, just so you know, independents and Republicans can vote in the Democratic primary, but they can only vote in one primary. So it's not too likely that Republicans are going to vote in the Democratic primary, but independents definitely. And people that are really high up with independents are Bernie Sanders, not so much Joe Biden, but Joe Biden is still at a not close, but still second place, and Elizabeth Warren is at third place. Actually, one thing I want to point out, before we move on, is the fact that Kamala Harris, typically around third place nationwide, and then followed by Beto O'Rourke, is actually behind O'Rourke and Elizabeth Warren. It seems like this progressive vote really coming out for people like Warren, and not so much for people like Harris or O'Rourke. Keep in mind, Warren really doesn't go up there, even though she is very well known. She doesn't really strike that high up there on the national Democratic polls. So I do think that it is pretty interesting that she is third place in this poll. But what direction should the Democratic Party move in? Now, if you're looking back, remember that Bernie Sanders had 39% of the vote. Joe Biden had 24% of the vote. Now, what direction should the Democratic Party move in? Again, if we're looking at right-wing voters, taking out all of those other Democrats, that 16% of the vote is going to go to Joe Biden, without a doubt. There is no way that these people who want to move more to the right are going to go for Bernie Sanders. Now, that's 16% of the equation. If you go into the stay where it is column, that's exactly what Joe Biden is pretty much going to be relying on. Those voters that are content with what's happening with the Democratic Party and don't want it to change too much. Now, obviously there are some voters who want it to move slightly to the left. Right now, if you just add up the stay where it is and the right-wing voters, that puts Joe Biden at a 46% total. Now, this is a hypothetical between a two-person race. It's just interesting looking at the numbers, but 46% of the vote would go to Joe Biden, assuming that everyone who wants to move to the left and move to the significantly to the left would go to Bernie Sanders. That puts them at, 31 plus 24, 55% of the vote. Now, that doesn't exactly add up because 30 plus 31 plus 24 should not, wait, maybe I'm not smart, but no. Okay, so yeah, I guess I'm not wrong about that. It is 1% off. But legitimately, looking at this data, it seems like those voters who want to move it more to the right are divided amongst voters, whether it's Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Beto O'Rourke, a lot of these top Democrats that aren't exactly progressives, and again, they're not exactly conservatives either, but they do want the Democratic Party to move a little bit more to the right. There is no way they're voting for Bernie Sanders. Now, for those that do want to move it to the left, there is a possibility they could vote for Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders just seems to drastically move himself away from the rest of the party in terms of like the Hillary Clinton type of the Democratic Party. But Joe Biden could win some left-wing voters. Bernie Sanders is not winning those right-wing voters. And I'm not saying that this puts Joe Biden at a better position than Bernie Sanders, because it doesn't. They're still in the minority in terms of, even if you add all the right and stay where it is voters, they're still in the minority. I just think that it's interesting to look at those numbers and just allocate those to different candidates, to the two different candidates, and see the numbers. But that's a whole nother ball game. So we've discussed that. We've discussed the 2020 Democratic numbers. Again, looking at what happens if Joe Biden decides against running. I always think that it's interesting that it goes down to a two-person race between Bernie Sanders and Beto O'Rourke. Beto O'Rourke definitely could replace Joe Biden, but if anyone, I think it would be Kamala Harris, considering that she's already third nationwide and third now in the state of Wisconsin if Joe Biden does not run, which is pretty interesting that Elizabeth Warren is in third with Joe Biden possibly running, and then it jumps up to Kamala Harris. Now, let's go ahead and look at some of the approval polls of the president, and then we'll get to the general election polls. Now, this is interesting. This state seems split down the middle on almost every issue except for healthcare. Looking at I'm actually just going to read this. When asked about specifics regarding the president, 49% of voters here agreed that he has kept his campaign promises. 51% claimed he has not. That does not match the approval numbers that we see. So people can disapprove of him while still thinking that he follows through with this stuff. And the 49 that says that he has followed through with his campaign promises may not like his campaign promises and may not vote for him. That 51% that says he has not may like his campaign promises and are just waiting for him to follow through and still going to vote for him. Now, in terms of certain issues, abortion 49 to 50. That's not something that's a really a top discussion as of right now. It's more immigration, more healthcare, foreign policy, and definitely economic policy above anything else. But 47% approve for immigration, 52% disapprove. That's interesting considering that the wall, has not been built yet. I think that's something that's going to probably hurt him in the general election. Healthcare obviously is going to hurt him. Obamacare is still in place. We're not seeing too much hope for the GOP there. Foreign policy, a lot of the mainstream media is painting Donald Trump and putting up headlines that show him to be a quote-unquote embarrassment to the country. So that makes sense that his approval rating is lower in that aspect than anywhere else except for healthcare. And economic policy, that's his highest. Now, that makes sense. He's a businessman. Obviously, he knows a little bit more about the economy than the average person. And then one thing that I actually thought that was pretty interesting, they asked about credibility of sources of information, and 40% of people said cable news was their most trusted source, 26% said online, and 23% said newspapers, and then 11% said social media. Now, Fox News ranks at the top, which is interesting, 36%, and then MSNBC at second, 19%, and CNN at third with 16%, and CBS at 11%, NBC 10%, and ABC 9%. I just think that it's interesting that Fox is at 36%, but it also makes sense with the electorate that they're working with. And here's the big deal besides the Democratic primary: general election matchups. What is interesting is that although Sanders does win in the Democratic primary, Biden leads in the general election more than Sanders leads. There's an 8-point gap between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, a 4-point gap between Elizabeth Warren and Donald Trump, a 4-point gap between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, a 0 gap between Trump versus Harris, a 2% gap between Beto O'Rourke and Donald Trump, and a 0% gap between Donald Trump and Amy Klobuchar. Now, again, all those gaps were with Democrats leading, of course, as you can see on the graph. But it's just interesting that Biden would somehow lead Trump more than even though he is second place in the Democratic primary, which means that not everyone who's voting in that primary not everyone who's voting for Bernie Sanders in the primary may be dead set on only voting for Bernie Sanders. And then they threw Howard Schultz in. Of course, he's the independent candidate, former CEO of Google. Not Google, Starbucks. Former CEO of Google, went to my high school. Sorry. Starbucks, he has money. He's probably not going to drop out of this race. He's going to announce soon, most likely. And it just seems like he's probably going to stay in this race. Now, even then, Biden still gets 51% of the vote, but Bernie Sanders only gets 48%. So Bernie Sanders seems to drop a little bit more. Biden drops 3%. Sanders drops 4%. That's not too good of a sign, considering that these races, again, are probably going to be decided by less than 1%, even without Howard Schultz. So that's something that really needs to be watched. Now, that pretty much wraps up today's overall view of the Emerson poll. I do think that's pretty interesting. Sanders definitely with a large lead in the state of Wisconsin, but again, things can change. But I think that's a good sign for him, considering that he was not starting out leading in the state of Wisconsin early on in 2016, and he is now. And we still have 1 year to go. So again, thank you guys for watching this video. Comment down suggestions below, and I will see you all tomorrow.